Hello, everyone, and welcome to Now That's Debatable. This is your host, Fantastic Facade. And today we are doing something a little bit different. Instead of doing a debate podcast, we're actually going to be doing the first of our informational and educational series. So I appreciate you guys tuning in if you were here. And instead of doing a debate, so it's not really going to be necessarily a debatable topic, it's going to be an informational, educational topic, but feel free to ask questions in chat. Feel free to comment, like, subscribe, share, all the fun stuff. And I am going to go ahead and get things kicked off. I'm playing music in the background. I'm not sure if you can hear it. If so, I hope it's not too distracting over my voice. I also have a little avatar up on the screen. So if you are watching, there's an avatar up. And I should have everything up and running. I should have a say hello up in chat, and then I am going to share it to our Facebook page, or our Facebook group. That way it's all in one spot. I do have the voice calls up, so you should be able to see the number scrolling up on the screen as we speak if you decide you would like to call in. Again, this is not a debating topic, but it's just a informational and educational one. So as soon as I get this shared, I will take off, but we're going to be talking about the 3 laws of logic today. So I hope you guys learned something, and if you're already extremely familiar with all of this stuff, then you may not learn anything, but I hope you still learn something anyway. I hope you enjoy it nonetheless. If you're not too familiar with the 3 basic laws of logic, hopefully you learn a little something today, and I hope that you find it informational and educational and a little bit entertaining as well. Nonetheless, it's shared to our page and it's shared to our group page. If you'd like to call in, the number is scrolling up on the screen. It's 202-888-5350. My typical co-host, Geocentric Skeptic, is on vacation this week, so I'm going to be going solo, so there's no additional host. Without further ado, let's take on the 3 basic laws of logic, i.e. the 3 laws of thought. So, just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, then we're going to hop right in. The 3 laws, what are they? We're going to talk about what they are. We're going to take a deep dive into each one of them with examples and 2 quick detours into quantum physics. And then we're also going to talk about why it matters. Why is logic important? Why is knowing the laws of logic and having these tools at your disposal important in general? I think it's a very important topic, and that's why I just wanted our first educational and informational series to be on the topic. So let's jump right into the 3 laws, and we'll go from there. So the first of the 3 laws is also known as the law of identity. It's sometimes shorthand listed as A equals A, i.e. the law of definition. And I'll get into a deep dive of that. The next slide is actually going to be on specifically the law of identity, and we're going to talk about that and why it matters. Sorry if you see my head moving around and all that fun stuff. I'm actually monitoring like 3 screens and just trying to make sure everything's in place, but nonetheless. With that in mind, the second law is known as the law of excluded middle. That's often shorthand as A is either A or not A, i.e. the law of excluded third. And by the law of excluded third, we mean that there is no third option. So it's either A is indeed A or A is not A. There is no other option. A can only be A or not A. Versus having a third option, like A could also be B. Well, that's not really the case in the excluded middle, but we'll get to that a little later. Lastly, the third law is going to be the law of non-contradiction, which is often shorthand as A cannot be not A, i.e. the principle of contradiction. So by stating that A is not A, you're stating a contradiction in itself. The law of non-contradiction basically states that A cannot be not A, and again, we'll deep dive into that in a couple of minutes. So let's start off with the law of identity. The law of identity is one of the most fundamental and important laws in logic, and it's incredibly helpful when considering things like arguments, when considering taking on other people either in a debate or in a Facebook page or wherever you're arguing, because identity is how essentially the two people need to define terms. And if you have a different definition of different terms, then you're going to have issues coming to the same, coming to an agreement on terms and topics, because you're not talking about the same thing. So something that's really important, and something that should probably be paid most attention to in the three laws is, of course, the law of identity. A equals A, as I mentioned, shorthand. The definition, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is of identity is the relation that everything has to itself and to nothing else. So the two main philosophers that you're going to be looking into when considering the law of identity are going to be Plato and Socrates. And then we're going to dive a little bit into fungibility versus sentimentality, the ship of Theseus and Heraclitus, Iron Man and Tony Stark, and essential versus accidental properties. And all of these things are directly related to the law of identity. So obviously, Plato and Socrates are two of the biggest and most well-known philosophers in history, and they came up with their own versions of the law of identity and what it means. And by doing so, they've given us kind of their first rule of laws of basic logic. That means that essentially we have the first rule, which is necessary, but these three rules are just a guideline to start your basis of logic. They're by no means any reason or way that this is going to be all that you use for logic or all that you use in an argument, but they're very good to know and very good to have. So let's talk about fungibility versus sentimentality. When it comes to identity, we'll talk about fungibility. Fungibility is basically this concept that you may have involving something that you own. Good example of that is money. Let's say that you have a $100 bill sitting up on the counter. I know it belongs to you. I take that $100, I go out and make a purchase with it. On the way back home from my purchase, I stop and by the bank, I withdraw out $100 cash. I come back, I put the $100 bill back on the table. Now, although it's not right for me to take your property without asking, since that $100 was yours and it's back in place, most people aren't going to have an issue with taking that money. That idea and concept is called fungibility. Now, let's go to the same thing, and we'll use a very simple, short-lived pet. But let's say you have a goldfish, and you're out and away on vacation, and I'm babysitting for your goldfish, and I'm supposed to come by and take care of it. One day when I go and I notice that your goldfish he's gone. He's no longer with us. But I happen to know a nearby pet store that has goldfish that look identical to the one that you had. I go out and I buy a goldfish, and I put it in the bowl. When you come back home, you're none the wiser. Now, if you have a problem with that versus the $100 bill stance, that problem comes in fungibility versus sentimentality. Because you don't necessarily look at things like pets or gifts from your children, or things that you've had for a long time. They have sentimental value to you, hence the term sentimentality. The same way you look at something like money, which is fungible. So let's go from there into the ship of Theseus, which is one of the prime examples of how we use identity and how we understand and comprehend identity in a modern philosophy today, and using it for logic. So the concept of the ship of Theseus, which was posed by Heraclitus, the ancient philosopher, basically around the same time of Plato and Socrates, the ship of Theseus is this concept that if a person buys a ship, and let's think an older wooden ship with sails, and it employs a number of people to work on the ship, and it's takes this really long journey around the globe, right? And in the process, you have to repair panels on the ship. And unfortunately, some of your crewmen either get sick or die, or they just don't want to work there anymore, so you have to replace the crewmen as well. And by the time your ship of Theseus has made its entire journey and come back, you've replaced every panel on the ship, you've replaced the sails, and you've replaced every person. The question of identity is it still the ship of Theseus? Because this is where the law of identity lies. When we're talking about identity, we're talking about what something is and its relationship to itself. So is the ship of Theseus the same ship as when it left? Some arguments would say, yeah, it's the same ship. It was only replaced bit by bit, but it's maintained the title, even though none of the properties of the ship are the same. The sails aren't the same, the panels aren't the same, the crew's not the same. So the question is, if you think it's a new ship, at what point in time did it stop being the ship of Theseus? And Heraclitus would say that the ship of Theseus was different in every moment. It doesn't contain any of the same properties at any point in time, because something is always changing about the ship. Now, that could be something like time itself. That could be something like the wear and tear of the ocean or the seas on the ship. It could be when you start replacing panels. It could be when you start replacing the crew. But the fact of the matter is, the ship of Theseus is in a constant state of change. So there's a way of looking at that, and then a way of kind of looking at ourselves. Like, there's you, and then there's a you when you were a baby or a small child. Are you the same? Well, you don't have any of the same cells that you had when you were born. If you're older than about 10 years old, you don't have any of the same cells. You're not made up of the same materials. You probably don't like the same foods. You don't talk the same way. You probably don't look the same as you did 10 or 15 years ago. So, what's you? How do you identify yourself? And I could do an entire episode on personal identity, but we're just going to kind of stick to and just kind of put the thought out there of like what makes a person themselves. Given that we only have an hour to take on all three topics. With that in mind, we'll go ahead on into another good example of identity is Iron Man and Tony Stark. So I'm sure most people that may watch this have seen some, if not all, of the major Marvel movies that have come out, including Iron Man and the Avengers, which have Robert Downey Jr. playing Tony Stark and Iron Man. And if you're not at all familiar with the characters, Tony Stark is a genius billionaire that builds a Iron Man suit and uses it to fight crime and fly around and do all these other things. When it comes to the law of identity and why this is important, are Tony Stark and Iron Man the same? Are there differences to them? Are they the same person? Because you would say that it's only true of Tony Stark that Tony Stark's a billionaire and that he's dating Pepper Potts. You would say it's only true of Iron Man that he flies around and fights crime and goes and takes on aliens in New York. But Tony Stark is Iron Man and Iron Man is Tony Stark. But if you separate them, are they their own identities? And that's kind of why we're going into this. It's really important to identify when talking about things, and that's when we get to the end of the podcast here. We're going to explain why all these things are very important. But it's just a really good thought process to kind of think about, are Iron Man and Tony Stark the same? Since we're talking about the relationship things have to themselves and nothing else, you could argue that maybe Iron Man and Tony Stark aren't the same. Perhaps they're completely different beings. Iron Man is only Iron Man because of the suit. Tony Stark is only Tony Stark because he doesn't have the suit. But again, that's just something to kind of mull over and consider. And a way to help us consider that is by looking at essential versus accidental properties. And essential versus accidental properties are pretty hard to determine, especially when you consider identity and how we look at other things and other beings and creatures and things of that nature. So when considering essential versus accidental properties, we can this sentence is false. So we'll get to that. Comment, this sentence is false. So that's going to come into a logical fallacy later, into something like the law of non-contradiction, because if the sentence is false, then nothing about it. It's called the sentence problem, or the semantics problem. Basically, we're using words to mean something other than what they actually are. A sentence that says this sentence must be false, if it is indeed false, is telling itself a lie. But that's a semantical issue, not necessarily a logical one. So having a definition of what we're talking about and considering semantics versus strict logic will be helpful there. But when considering essential versus accidental properties, there are accidental properties. For instance, the Iron Man suit is often considered like gold and red or gold and burgundy. There are other iterations and colors for it, but if you painted them a different color, it wouldn't take anything away from it being Iron Man. And Tony Stark is known to have, a haircut. He's played by Robert Downey Jr. He's considered to have this snarky attitude. If he changed his attitude or was having a bad day, you wouldn't say it's no longer Tony Stark. Even if Tony Stark gave away all his money, these are accidental properties. These are things that are just by happenstance. They belong to this person. This dog has black fur. That's an accidental property because not all dogs have black fur. Therefore, there are properties, such as the fur of dogs, that can be different. Some dogs don't have any fur. Some dogs have fur that's white or yellow or a number of colors. When it comes to essential properties, we're asking the question, what makes this thing what it is? In the case of Tony Stark, is there anything you could take away that would no longer make Tony Stark Tony Stark? Is there anything you could take away from a dog that it would no longer be a dog? And so these are essential properties, and you notice they're a lot harder to come up with examples for than for something like accidental properties, like the color of a dog or the amount of wealth that Tony Stark has. With that in mind, I think we can move on to our second of the major laws, and I will get that screen over now, which is the law of excluded middle. And so this one is probably, personally, the hardest one to discuss. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to do my best to get a good example out there and a good definition out there of the law of excluded middle. So it says, the way I explain it is that the truth value can't be determined. Yeah, so that's a good way of putting like a semantical sentence of such as this sentence is false. Is that you can't determine the value of truth because you're stating in and of itself that the idea itself is false or the concept is false, the sentence is false. So for the law of excluded middle, let's go ahead and knock it out. It's A is either A or not A. So we're going to be kind of going over Aristotle versus Nelson Goodman in the future. The Black Swan Theory by David Hume. We're going to take a quick dive into quantum of physics. This is going to be part 1. Part 2 will be in the law of non-contradiction. We're going to talk a little bit briefly about Pascal's wager, and then we're going to talk about the principle of bivalence. It says a lot of people see truth and false as logical negations, but they aren't. It's either truth or not true, false or not false. It's a very good point, which is why on the bottom of the screen here, if you're checking it out, I have the principle of bivalence up. And I have in parentheses, it is not equivalent to the law of excluded middle, and I will address that accordingly. Aristotle versus Nelson Goodman in the future, we'll talk about that. So the law of excluded middle, A is either A or not A. So what we mean by that is that something either is, by definition, what we say it is, or it is not, by definition, what we say it is. So now that we've established what our definition is, if we say dogs are four-legged mammals, then having a two-legged reptile would not be a dog. So you would say it's either A, a dog, a two-legged reptile, by definition, is either A, a dog, or B, not a dog. What you couldn't do is say that it's not a dog, therefore it must be something else. You could also say that you could also go into the idea and concept that something might be a dog in the future, which is why we talked about we have Nelson Goodman in the future here, who actually presented a theory called GRU. And if you're not familiar with the theory of GRU, he stated that all emeralds are green until observed at a certain point in time in the future. And then, at a certain point in time in the future, all emeralds will be blue. We have just not yet experienced that point in the future. Therefore, all emeralds are both green and blue until a T time in the future. And Aristotle actually disagreed with this. He would say that it's all emeralds are green. By all observations, emeralds will be green, and by definition of how we define emeralds is that they're green gemstones. And since no one has ever observed them in the future as being blue, and we're much later in the future and in the present than Aristotle was in the past, and emeralds still don't change colors. But the whole point of the theory is that you have this concept called gruness, that everything that is currently green could potentially be blue in the future at a certain time. And since it's GRUE, G-R-U-E, if you will, it's green and blue. All emeralds are currently green. At a point in time in the future, they will be blue. But emeralds can't be both green and not green. So it's not that emeralds can't be green and blue. It's either emeralds are currently green or they are not currently green. That doesn't mean that you get to qualify or quantify what other colors emeralds might be. It just means that they're either green or they are not. So that's where the excluded middle is. It's not giving you a third option, which is why this is also called the law of excluded third, because it's not presenting third options. It's not presenting additional options. Another option and another concept involving the law of excluded middle that kind of helps people grasp this idea and this concept is the black swan theory, which was presented by David Hume. He's a Scottish philosopher. He basically said to kind of get the concept of what the law of excluded middle is, he said, imagine that you live in the United States and you know what a swan is. And every swan you've ever seen is white. You've never seen a black swan. Therefore, no black swans exist, because either all swans are white or all swans are not white. And then you move to Australia, where swans are actually typically black. And for the first time in your whole life, you see a black swan. Well, now you have kind of excluded conflicting information, because for your whole life, you've known swans are white. And now you have this black swan, which doesn't fit into your dichotomy, your understanding of what a swan is. But you don't go the reason you have the law of excluded middle is it's not so you jump around back and forth or kind of go crazy or try to rack your brain about what's happening. It's now you know that all swans are not white. Therefore, it's either A or not A. In the case of all swans being white, it is not the case. Not all swans are white. Therefore, you have this black swan theory. And it was an idea of basically going into just using and utilizing this information kind of as an abductive and inductive theory. Virtual particles may break the law of non-contradiction because the particle can have properties without existing. Never mind, I'm skipping ahead. Yes, indeed you are. We're actually going to get into the law of non-contradiction on the next screen, and we're actually going to take a quick jump into quantum physics now, since that's what you're talking about a little bit. You're talking about virtual particles, and you could be potentially talking about quantum computing and quantum physics, quantum interlocking, and quantum indeterminacy. So not to get too technical, because this is a kind of a deep dive into logic itself and the three basic laws. I'm not trying to overflood people with information and jump all over the place. But there's quantum physics on the screen, and that's not to scare anyone away or to confuse anyone, but it's something that's important to consider when looking at the law of excluded middle, because in things like quantum computing or in quantum physics, supposedly you can have not supposedly, you can have a superposition of two states. And the really, really famous case, if you've ever looked into anything in quantum physics, was called by a guy named Erwin Schrödinger, who came up with this concept of putting a cat in a box with a cesium atom and some radioactive material, and basically said that essentially the cat in the box is either a superposition of being both dead and alive, because until you open up the box and collapse the wave function, you do not know whether the wave function itself has collapsed, and therefore the cat is both alive and dead. Does this break the law of excluded middle? Because it's either alive and not alive at the same time. The answer is no. It's in a superpositional state, or it's not in a superpositional state. So it doesn't break the law of excluded middle, even using things like Schrödinger's cat or in quantum computing, where you talk about it being a 1 or a 0. It's actually just in a superpositional state. So, and that's going to be very similar to how we take on the law of non-contradiction in quantum physics, but we'll get to that and kind of go back around to the comment where it talks about how it may break the law of non-contradiction, although I think that we've kind of seen that it doesn't technically do so. With that in mind, we'll get out of quantum physics and back to our state of logic, because I think it's important, and we'll talk briefly about Pascal's wager. And the reason I wanted to bring up Pascal's wager is because I'm in a lot of religious and philosophical debate groups on Facebook under the name Fantastic Facade. If you're a fan of our page, if you've watched these videos, then that's me. I'm Fantastic Facade, and I am interacting with these people through that name and through that utilization of Facebook and whatnot. I don't have a personal Facebook page, but that's just personal preference. I just use this to basically interact with people, debate with people, comment on topics that I find interesting, and that's kind of where this whole concept and this whole idea for a podcast came from. And a good buddy of mine agreed to co-host it with me, and so that's literally where all of this came from. But Pascal's wager is a really good example of people that think they have a inclusion of law of excluded middle. And Pascal's wager essentially says that, and I'll give the example of Allah. So Allah is the God that is worshipped by Muslims in the Islam faith. And they may try to convert people to the Islam faith by saying that if Allah is real, then you'll have 72 virgins waiting for you when you die, assuming that you worship and praise Allah and that you follow Allah's commands that are in the Quran. And then the question is, well, what if Allah is not real? Like, what if the Allah that you worship, what if that's not true? The question then goes, well, if I'm wrong, or the idea and concept goes, if I'm wrong about Allah, then when I die, nothing happens to me. But if you're wrong about Allah, when you die, then you'll be punished for not believing in Allah. And so they think they've come to this idea and this concept of the law of excluded middle. And if you look at it just briefly, you may also come to that conclusion. However, Pascal's wager is a good example of why this is not an example of the law of excluded middle. Because it's not whether this thing is true or false, it's whether there are any other options at all. And so the question is, what if Allah is not correct? What if there is no Allah? What if the whole concept of Allah is incorrect? Well, that doesn't mean that Christianity or Hinduism or Shinto is correct. It doesn't give any more credence to a different belief. All it shows is that the current belief you have is incorrect. It doesn't give any more evidence for another belief. It doesn't provide any additional credence or speak any truth value to any other belief. What you're doing is you're equivocating when you think there's only two options, which is what the law of excluded middle is. And what I'm saying, and when you talk about Pascal's wager, what's happening is that's not the only option. It's not talking about truth. It's talking about if Allah exists and we worship him, we will be given 72 virgins when we die. If he doesn't exist, then you won't get 72 virgins when you die. But it doesn't mean that, therefore, Krishna exists or that Hinduism is correct. It just means that this Islam particular stance is incorrect. And that's where I want to jump into the principle of bivalence, which we had a comment earlier that says it's either truth or not truth, false or not false. A lot of people see true and false as logical negations, but they aren't. In logic, that's a very important distinction to make, which is why I have the principle of bivalence on the screen, which is not the same as the law of excluded middle. The principle of bivalence states that something is either true or it is not true. And it follows the same as the law of excluded middle, and it says something is either false or it is not false. And there's a big distinction that we want to make in truth versus not truth and truth versus false. So I can say with pretty good confidence that it is true that there is not currently a teapot orbiting Saturn. However, I can't say that it's false that there's a teapot orbiting Saturn, because proving something to be false would indicate that I've eliminated every other possibility. And I can say that in the future, it is possible, for whatever reason, humans could potentially take and put a teapot into orbit around Saturn. Therefore, in the future, the statement could be true. However, currently, which is why we use very strict definitions in the law of identity and the law of definition, as I mentioned before, and you'll notice these kind of build on top of each other. But the principle of bivalence says that things are either true or they're not true. They're either false or they're not false. And when we're talking about the law of excluded middle, once we have a law of definition, dogs are four-legged mammals. It's either a four-legged mammal or it's not a four-legged mammal. So once we have this definition, A equals A, four-legged mammals are four-legged mammals, and then this is either a four-legged mammal or it's not a four-legged mammal. It doesn't speak to truth in any way. The law of definition, the law of excluded middle, nor the law of non-contradiction, which we're going to get to, doesn't speak to truth. It speaks to logic. It speaks to logical foundation. It speaks to logical building. Principle of bivalence says in accordance with the three basic laws of logic, that something is either true or it is not true, which is an accurate statement. Something cannot be both true and not true at the same time. That's the law of non-contradiction. So it is either true, A, or it is either not A, not true. So I just wanted to kind of cover that since we had a mention of that in the comment section. And then I, again, wanted to a little bit avoid getting into a deep dive of quantum physics, but still, even with the law of excluded middle, when we talk about something like Schrodinger's cat, when we talk about quantum computing and quantum entanglement, we're not breaking the law of excluded middle. We're not destroying the three basic laws of logic, but I did want to bring up quantum physics because I was aware that someone would potentially be watching that would likely bring up this exact topic if I didn't kind of nip it in the bud. So, without further ado, we'll get into probably the easiest for most people to understand and the easiest for a classic example of information to happen, and that's the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is one of the easiest to grasp, I think, for most people when it comes to the three of the basic laws. Understanding what something is, people actually tend to have a hard time identifying something and coming to the same definition of something. And you'll notice that a lot in religious topics. You'll notice that a lot in even non-religious topics when they're talking about just issues that people don't necessarily talk about often. You'll have different definitions and you'll talk past each other. You'll talk beyond each other, which is why it's really, really important to have a good definition of something. And if you don't know what a definition of something is, actually, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself for the next slide, but I'll get back around to it. But the law of non-contradiction is A cannot be not A. So something cannot be a four-legged mammal and it can be not a four-legged mammal simultaneously in the same time and in the same plane of existence. And so a dog, if we define a dog as a four-legged mammal and we say a dog is a dog, dog is a dog, definition, a dog is either a dog or it's not a dog, law of excluded middle. A dog cannot be a dog and not a dog at the same time. Law of non-contradiction. So Aristotle kind of deep dove into this and in his Metaphysics when he gave three examples of the law of non-contradiction. He gave the ontological, the psychological, and the logical view of non-contradiction. And if you're not familiar with these terms, ontological is the term to, it means existence. It's how we relate and refer to something's existence. Psychological is what we believe and what we process in our heads. And then logical is what we argue. It's what we debate. It's what we put forward premises and come to a conclusion over. So, for instance, his example, the classic example Aristotle gave of an ontological law of non-contradiction would say that you either exist or you do not exist. That would be an ontological argument. It would say that you're either one or the other. You cannot both exist and not exist simultaneously, and I know there's going to be a question, or I bet there's going to be a question involving the quantum physics of quantum indeterminacy and particles popping in and out of existence seemingly at random in the future, which is why I have it listed on the screen. Trying to cut that to cut to the chase on that. The psychological concept that Aristotle gave in the law of non-contradiction is you either believe something exists or you believe it does not exist. A classic example is that you believe dogs exist. You could also believe that dogs do not exist. And then the logical one in the law of non-contradiction is that you basically come up with a premise A. The best one is A is cannot be not A, which is the logical form of the law of non-contradiction. So when we talk about these things, again, none of these three principles have anything to do with truth. And that's something I want to be very clear with, because you can use all three of these principles to come up with random thought processes and thought experiments that have nothing to do with truth or reality. And what I mean by that is that you can use these principles to come up with syllogisms that are completely random, just to test to see if your structure for logic and reasoning is valid. And so I'll give you a really good example. Sorry, let me try that sentence again. The law of non-contradiction would say that either aliens exist or they do not exist, right? That's the law of excluded middle. They either exist or do not exist. But aliens, by definition, law of identity, cannot be not aliens. So aliens, by definition of the word, cannot be from Earth. So, unless we're talking about like an alien to your country, but we're talking about aliens from other planets in most cases, which is why it's important, again, to have a really good definition. So the law of non-contradictions, aliens, if we're talking about people from other planets or beings from other planets, cannot be from Earth by definition, because it would break the law of non-contradiction by definition. So we're going to get into, now we're going to go a little bit into paradoxes and oxymorons, because both of those actually deal directly with the law of non-contradiction. And a paradox is basically a seemingly self-contradictory statement. And it seems that it's possible to come up with something reasonable, but then what ends up happening is you've created a paradox. A classic example is this sentence is false. It's a paradox, because if it is indeed false, then the sentence is true, but it can't be true by stating it's false. It's a paradox. There are other really classic examples of paradoxes out in the world. I'm sure you've heard the term before, so I won't delve and spend too much time on it. The example of an oxymoron is when we're using, most of the time, a semantical term to create a statement that's seemingly true and untrue. And by that, I mean, like, let's say your best friend just got a new dog and you don't think the dog is very cute. Your best friend thinks the dog is the most adorable puppy in the whole world, and you think it's not so great. You might describe it, not to your friend because you don't want to hurt their feelings, as a pretty ugly dog. But pretty and ugly are antonyms. They mean different things. So you have an oxymoron in the same sentence. You might say it's pretty ugly. It's not the ugliest dog you've ever seen. It's just pretty ugly. Or a more common one that's kind of in younger people's lingo is it's stupid smart. Like, it's so smart that it's mind-blowingly stupid. Or it's so stupid that it's mind-blowingly smart. So those are oxymorons, and they're part of... They don't break the law of non-contradiction. Things have to follow these laws. And now we're going to get into our second dive into physics, into quantum physics, because I'd wager, and I know people are watching and have, if you've done any research into quantum physics and quantum mechanics and quantum entanglement, then you may have questions about the law of non-contradiction. So the comment we had earlier, virtual particles may break the law of non-contradiction because a particle can have properties without existing. By that, we mean observed properties, or observed particles don't actually collapse the wave function. When a wave function collapses, we have quantum indeterminacy at play, which means that it's seemingly true that particles can exist and not exist in the same time in the same relation. So how does this and the law of non-contradiction work? Well, we're not exactly sure that that's specifically what happens, because anytime it's going unobserved, that just seems to be the case. However, even if this is the case, and we're talking about the law of non-contradiction, then we say that if you break it down to the same part, the same relation, the same time, then if something exists and does not exist, it can't be doing it in the same part, same relation, same time. So there's properties that happen when the wave function collapses, and it's only specific to when wave function collapses in quantum mechanics, which is kind of why we go back to like Schrodinger's cat and the law of excluded middle when we talk about some of the stuff, which is why I brought it up earlier, because this is a very specific microcosmic phenomena that seems to be contradictory to the basic laws of logic. However, I will give you solace that anything that is observed pretty much in your whole life, with exception of unless you're a quantum physicist studying the way quantum particles interact and react, and when the wave function collapses, you likely won't have a logical or philosophical issue of consistency with the three basic laws of logic. With that in mind, there are additional arguments against things like the law of non-contradiction, and that's verifiability and falsifiability, because we would say that in order for something to be a good argument, it needs to be two things. It needs to be verifiable and it needs to be falsifiable. And verifiable means that we need to verify that it is indeed the case. In the cases of when making an argument, if we say all dogs are four-legged mammals, but then we find a dog that only has 3 legs, is it still a dog? Well, yeah, it doesn't meet quite that verifiable standard because it's not verifiable. Not all dogs have 3 legs. It's a property that we've assigned to the typical dog. However, with that in mind, there are things that are verifiable. There are things that are observable that we can pretty much practice, and unless we're talking about the quantum realm or somewhere off planet, such as a vacuum, or if you're in a vacuum chamber for some reason, then you'll notice things like you'll be able to observe gravity. You hold something in the air, you let it go, you'll typically notice that it falls to the ground. Well, that's verifiable because I can do it where I live, you can do it where you live, people can do it anywhere they live. They can verify that that typically tends to be the case. Now, there are instances, for instance, like in vacuum chambers or near black holes, or in cases of in quantum mechanics, in which things don't seem to work the same way. Now, with that in mind, that doesn't mean they're necessarily verifiable or falsifiable. And since that's not necessarily the case, and we're talking about specifically the law of non-contradiction here, I'll get back to it. But something being falsifiable is also important, and it seems that the law of non-contradiction is a non-falsifiable claim. And what I mean by that is that we have no way of proving it wrong. And so it poses an issue because essentially, in order to have a good argument, you want something that is able to be falsifiable. And when you state something, you typically end up what's called moving the goalpost for what your examples are in falsifying an argument. So let's just say I can say aliens definitely exist, and by that I mean beings of other worlds. And you say, well, I can't really prove that. You can't really prove that wrong. And that's, for all intents and purposes, that's true. You cannot prove that aliens in somewhere else in the universe do not exist. So it's a non-falsifiable claim. And that makes for poor argument. The same can be said for the law of non-contradiction. It's a non-falsifiable claim. And so there are issues and there are arguments that are made against the law of non-contradiction for not being falsifiable. And then lastly, I just wanted to kind of wrap up on the law of non-contradiction by talking about Plato's axioms, which, when considering something in arguments and for reason, for the sake of logic, is that in order to not violate the law of non-contradiction, A cannot be not A. They must be of the same part, the same relation, and at the same time. So kind of like I mentioned with the teapot theory orbiting Saturn, is that there may not be a teapot orbiting Saturn currently, but in the future there might be. So having a teapot in the future would not violate the law of non-contradiction, because we're not talking about things at the same time. Just like 200 years ago, the internet didn't exist. So when I say, when I Google a certain word, it comes up with this definition. 200 years ago, it didn't come up with this definition. Well, of course it didn't, because the internet didn't exist 200 years ago. We have to talk about the same part during the same relation at the same time in order to have the law of non-contradiction be applicable to your scenario. So I think that's a pretty good deep dive into each of the three here. And now I think we should get into how to use it, aka why it matters. And I've sprinkled a little bit of this into the previous few minutes, but I kind of wanted to get into each of them a little bit more on how to use it and why it matters. So these are the three basic building blocks for logic. And what logic does and allows us to do is it allows us to come up with these things called syllogisms, which basically present two or more premises to come up with a conclusion. And you can determine whether that conclusion is valid or invalid, depending on how the argument is presented. If I say all dogs have white fur, Chocolate is the name of a dog, is the name of this dog in my room. Therefore, Chocolate has white fur. Well, that's a true statement. That's a valid form. Whether it's a true statement or not, it's not relevant. Because the valid form is that if all dogs have white fur, and Chocolate is a dog, even though the name might imply that it has a different color fur, but if all dogs indeed do have white fur, and Chocolate is indeed a dog, then Chocolate must have white fur. That doesn't mean that any of the things that you can come up with in these syllogisms relate to truth or reality. You can make anything up that you'd like to put into it. It just shows the validity of the argument you're using. And that's the whole purpose of logic. Logic is to show and to help people learn valid structure in argument. And these three are the very, very basics and the very, very stepping stones to do that. And when you're having an argument or when you're thinking or considering something, when anybody makes a statement, you need to know what they are defining. Does it violate the law of excluded middle? Is it A or not A? And then, or is it talking about the principle of bivalence, which is truth or non-truth? And then, is it in violation of the law of non-contradiction? It can't both be A and not A. So, syllogisms, which are, it's a fancy way of saying the same thing I just talked about, like all dogs have white fur, Chocolate is a dog, therefore Chocolate has white fur. That is an example of a logical syllogism. There are 256 known ways to formulate syllogisms, and they can get as basic as the one I just created, or I just made up. They can get as complicated as having, 15 or 20 premises that involve if and then statements and because, and you can, if no dog has white fur before blah, 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 you can make it really, really complicated. However, just know you don't have to memorize all 256 of them. You just, once you start to learn how syllogisms work, you can understand their validity and the soundness of your argument and other people's arguments when considering using logic and these three basic premises. And then, of course, you'll build upon your logic and your logical skills accordingly. But just know there are only 24 valid logical syllogisms out of the 256. So, like I mentioned earlier, it's not talking about truth. It's talking about validity. All dogs have white fur. Chocolate is a dog. Chocolate has white fur. That's a valid argument. It doesn't speak to the truth of the matter. Chocolate could be a brown dog, given that the name is Chocolate. But it doesn't matter whether the actuality is true. It matters whether the reasoning is sound. So, why else does it matter and how do we use it? Is to promote critical thinking. I the whole purpose of this channel, the whole purpose of coming up with a live debate channel and an interactive debate channel with a call-in option and chat up on the screen is so we continue to promote our own critical thinking, me and co-host and guest of the show, but we also promote critical thinking in other people. And this is something that is vitally important. It's something that I wish I had classes on when I was in high school or even younger, just to think critically. And I mean about everything. So whether you're thinking critically about what kind of pet you would like to purchase, or what religion you're going to follow, or what you're going to have for dinner. And I'm not saying you need to put an insane amount of effort and time and consideration into every single decision you ever make. I'm just saying when it comes to something that's important that can impact things like your financial future or your mental health or your life in general, it's very important to think critically. And that's something that we pride ourselves on promoting here at Now That's Debatable. It's something that we want to continue to promote and utilize to the best of our ability. And that also leaves you open for altering your views when evidence supports otherwise. And we'll get to evidence here in just a second, but I'm almost out of time, but that's okay. This is the last slide. With that in mind, there's a stance that I think that critical thinkers should take when going into any argument, when going into any debate, and going into any construct or any thought-provoking process, whether it be what pet you should buy next, what religion you're going to follow, if any, whether, aliens exist, no matter what you're talking about. And that is the skeptical stance. The skeptical stance is that you should be, I remain unconvinced until I am given evidence otherwise. And so, do aliens exist? I don't know. However, I don't see good evidence that they do. And by evidence, I mean, although there are tons of different kinds of evidence, so we'll just jump right into this. Evidence versus proof. Proof is a logical statement that we just talked about, these syllogisms. Aliens are beings that exist on other planets. Other planets exist, therefore aliens exist. You notice that there's a logical inconsistency here. That is not a valid argument. But that would be if you were making a construction and you could say both premises are true, you would have a valid argument. Evidence can be anything from personal testimony, like I saw a UFO, therefore aliens existed, to we found the corpse of an alien in a desert, or some being that we have never seen before, and it doesn't appear to be from Earth, These are evidences that aliens might exist. So there's a difference between evidence and proof. When someone asks you to prove something, just know that proof is typically reserved for logic and for math. You set up a syllogism or you do the math. When someone asks for an example or evidence for something, they're asking for what is your personal reasoning? What is the ideas that you have that led you to this conclusion? And so that's something to consider and keep in mind. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about why this matters is knowledge versus belief. By using logic, you can know things. If you assume certain things to be true, like we assume premise 1 and premise 2 are true, the conclusion must be true. If other planets exist, then aliens must exist. Premise A, premise B. Other planets exist, premise C, therefore aliens exist, conclusion. So that is a logical proof that you can know. You know that is logically correct, it's sound, it's a valid reason. However, you may not believe that aliens are true. And even if you believe something, you may not necessarily know it, but that's kind of getting into a little semantics and ideology that we can say for another day. With that in mind, it is possible to believe things that do not coincide with reality. It is not necessarily possible to know things that do not coincide with reality. And the classic example that I typically give of this is that it is possible you believe in fairies. It is possible that fairies exist. It is not possible that you know fairies exist because it is not proven that fairies do indeed exist. So with all of that in mind, that is a deep dive into the 3 basic laws of logic. That is the end of my slideshow, and it is the end of today's discussion. I do want to thank Joshua for commenting and giving some feedback in the chat. I do want to briefly plug us because we do put a lot of time and effort into this kind of thing, and it is something that we both feel very passionate about, Geocentric Skeptic and I, and it's something that we've had guest speakers come along and do. So if you're watching this, if you have watched this, if you listened to it, if we uploaded it and you downloaded the podcast, if you're on Facebook, if you're on YouTube, if you're on Twitch, please do us a favor. Two things. One, give us feedback or a comment just saying, I watched this, I enjoyed it, I watched it, I didn't enjoy it, whatever. Two, if you did for any reason enjoy it, or you wanted to watch it, or you think that you know someone that might enjoy this kind of content, please share it. It doesn't cost you anything, and it doesn't take 2 seconds of your time. Please share it, because we do have a Facebook page, and we do have a Facebook group, and we're over 350 likes on our page, and we're very appreciative of those. We're up to almost 300 people in the group, and we're very appreciative for the people that are there. But we'd like more engagement. We'd like to reach to more people, and if you're watching this, please share it to your own page. Share it to your friend's page. If you know someone that likes debating, if you know someone that likes arguing, if you know someone that enjoys things like logic, philosophy, religion, anything that we've ever talked about in the past or anything that we may talk about in the future, we are open to discussion. We're open to changing our minds. We're also open to taking on new topics. We look for suggestions, we look and read comments, we respond accordingly. We may not get everything right, but we will do our best to do so, and we'll do our best to correct ourselves if we do make a mistake. So, from the very bottom of my heart, thank you, and I'm sure Gio, if he was here with me, he would say thank you as well for watching and listening. Please do give us a share, give us a comment, let us know some feedback, give us a topic that you want us to discuss. Next week, we'll probably be back to the normal debate format instead of the educational series. However, if you did enjoy the educational style format of today's show, please let us know that as well, because we plan on doing additional educational style format in the future, where we take on things just like this. We may create a presentation. We also may have professors and or guest lecturers come on and speak that are experts on the subject. With all that in mind, again, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please give us a like, a share, and we'll see you next week.